The year is 2025. A semiconductor engineer sits in Taipei, receiving the call that her factory will move. Not to Vietnam, not to Malaysia, to India. You'd think this transition was inevitable. It wasn't. 10 years ago, India made phones the way Walmart manufactured shoes. Cheap, visible, ultimately disposable. Your devices meant low-margin assembly work in undercapitalized zones. Something shifted entirely since then. Apple makes iPhones in India now at scales once unimaginable. Samsung's Noida facility runs 120 million phones per year in capacity. Your device increasingly carries a Made in India label. So the question, is India becoming the next China? The answer is far more complicated than headlines suggest. It's not even the right question to ask. Most analysts frame this as binary. Either India becomes the next manufacturing giant, or it doesn't. That framing misses the actual mechanism entirely. China didn't just grow, it absorbed a specific configuration of 1.4 billion people, coastal logistics networks 30 years in the making, supply chains feeding into one another, capital markets aligned with state direction. India has the population and trajectory, but lacks that same pathway. Your question should shift from whether India copies China to whether fragmented supply chains force investment toward India regardless of constraints. Not replacement, it's supplement, positioning, not destiny. But whether that positioning converts depends on what happens next. Start with accelerating fragmentation. Global trade fragmentation isn't new. US-China rivalry accelerated it sharply. In 2025, India's trade deficit with China hit $116 billion. Paradoxical, right? You're building manufacturing alternatives while importing 80% of electronics components from the country you're trying to avoid. But that paradox points to the mechanism directly. Western brands, Apple, Google, Samsung, move production in measured portions because they don't want single-country risk. They want China plus one, not replacement, complement. India sits in that sweet spot. Proximity to East Asian supply ecosystems, political alignment with Western partners, lower labour costs, and a population of 990 million people at working age. Your iPhone says Made in India because the US needed alternatives and India needed volume. The numbers behind that shift would surprise you. Numbers tell the story clearly. India's electronics manufacturing grew sixfold, from $21 billion in 2014 to 15 to $125 billion in 2024 to 25, while iPhone production moved from less than 1% in 2017 to 17% in 2025. Foxconn, Micron, and Samsung have opened major facilities, display operations, semiconductor assembly plants, and the world's largest mobile phone manufacturing plant. Tamil Nadu alone accounts for 37% of India's electronics exports. That's concentration, infrastructure, and momentum all accelerating together. But acceleration isn't completion. What happens when the growth hits constraints? Policy matters significantly. India's production-linked incentive scheme allocated roughly $26 billion across 14 sectors, with 755 applications approved. These incentives don't work everywhere. They work where clusters exist, where capital shows up, where logistics infrastructure exists. Electronics is the test case. Export growth reached 32% in FY 2024 to 25, while manufacturing FDI climbed to $19 billion. Policy removed friction on critical margins, tipping decisions that were already borderline for corporations making sourcing choices. Your phone got made in India because Apple wanted a second source, and the Indian government subsidized that decision effectively. Not accident. It's strategic alignment. Behind the headlines sits logistics, unglamorous but foundational. India's logistics cost fell dramatically from 14.4% of GDP to 7.97%, still higher than China once was, but moving decisively in the right direction. Port capacity doubled, with container dwell time at 3 days, faster than US ports. Dedicated freight corridors run at 96.4% commissioned, with significant rail operational capacity. Power installed exceeds 476 gigawatts, while energy shortages collapsed from severe deficits to basically zero. Solar capacity exploded in a decade. You can't move the massive volumes of US smartphone imports without reliable ports, trains, and electricity. India built this infrastructure, not at China's historical speed, but at sufficient speed to matter today. Here's where the script diverges from cheerleading versions. India can win selectively, but not completely. Why? 3 bottlenecks aren't fixable quickly. Land first. Your factory needs space. In China, the state moved you, cleared villages, paid compensation, built zones. In India, land acquisition takes up to 50 months, the single largest cause of project delays. Labour skills second. India has 990 million working-age people. That's scale. But 88.2% work in low-skill roles, and labour productivity is $8 GDP per working hour, ranked 133rd globally. You can hire fast, but can't train fast enough. Components third. 80% of electronics components are imported, 56% from China and Hong Kong specifically. You're building an alternative factory floor while purchasing components from the country you're avoiding. That's a structural contradiction, and each bottleneck feeds the next. Land is the clearest constraint. A semiconductor assembly facility in Gujarat needed 18 months for environmental clearance, plus 32 months for land acquisition, totaling 50 months before opening, while a Vietnamese competitor broke ground and opened in 26 months. India gained density but lost speed. This isn't unique to one site, it's the baseline. Contract enforcement alone takes 1,445 days in Indian courts versus 164 days in Singapore, 9 times longer. You can subsidize labour and invest in ports, but you can't shortcut legal systems. Land and contracts are the tax on doing business at India's scale. Selective geography emerges. Tamil Nadu, Bengaluru, Gujarat, Noida, not by choice, but by transaction costs. Factories cluster where bureaucracy is least punitive. Speed determines scale in this industry. Labour is the second knot. India's not short of people, it's short of trained people for specific manufacturing roles. Electronics assembly requires precision. Quality control demands discipline. India's skilling ecosystem turns out roughly 12 million vocational graduates yearly, which sounds large, but is small relative to manufacturing demand, where you need 150 million additional skilled workers. Labour productivity in Indian manufacturing remains 40% below Malaysia or Thailand, and not forever, just today. Today is when production lines need running. China solved this through decades of coastal migration and factory apprenticeships. India accelerates the timeline, while Samsung trains workers at scale and Foxconn runs academies. But you can't hire your way past a skill deficit in 3 years. That gap doesn't prevent India winning, it prevents India winning at the speed and volume of China's original transition, which matters enormously for the timeline. Here's the structural contradiction. To beat China requires capturing the supply chain, but capturing that chain requires importing from China. 80% of electronics components are imported, majority from the ecosystem you're positioning against. Not negligence, economic gravity. Component manufacturing requires vertically integrated suppliers that took 30 years to build in China and Taiwan, and nowhere else has comparable scale. India could build them, but that's capital and time intensive, so Samsung and Foxconn started upstream investments, while Micron's semiconductor assembly begins the process. Your iPhone assembled in India contains parts manufactured in Shenzhen, with only 15% domestic content. Not policy failure, this is how global supply chains actually distribute rather than relocate. India manufactures the lowest value portion. That's the mechanism at work, and it shapes what victory actually looks like. So where does India actually win? Selective geographic and sectoral victories. High-volume assembly where labour cost and scale converge. Smartphones, yes. Tablets and laptops, partially. Display manufacturing expanding. Server components growing. Segments where India's advantages align. Large working-age population, improving logistics, policy incentives, proximity to Southeast Asia demand. Not semiconductor fabrication at leading edge. That stays Taiwan and South Korea. Not cutting-edge chipset design. California keeps that. But the next tier exists. Assembly, testing, component manufacturing for mid-tier products. That shifts to India gradually. Your phone gets made there, your watch display comes from Tamil Nadu, your earbuds test in Bengaluru. That's actual victory, visible, measurable, worth billions yearly. Not dominance, it's dominion over throughput. Volume where India's constraints become advantages instead. Cost is what gets traded away for scale. Upstream suppliers locate elsewhere. High-margin semiconductor design stays in Singapore and the US. Advanced materials stay in established clusters. India doesn't build the full ecosystem. It captures throughput only. Your electronics manufacturing economy becomes profitable but dependent, leveraging young labour, low wages, and growing consumption to capture assembly contracts without diversifying into highest margin segments. India will be the largest alternative to China. Not replacement, not rival, alternative. Not small, alternatives to concentration represent genuine systemic risk mitigation worth billions, geopolitically significant. But understand clearly, your device gets manufactured in India. Others own how they're made. Not ownership, it's contract labour at scale. Electronics exports will likely surpass 150 billion by 2030. Massive economy building, but not independent, not complete, just a carefully cut slice where India's constraints don't dominate operations. As India wins selectively, visible metrics surge. Exports climb, FDI increases, unemployment drops. Political narratives harden. India is the next superpower, the new manufacturing heartland. Underneath that momentum, bottlenecks don't resolve, they hide. Land acquisition still takes 50 months. Courts still move glacially. Skills gaps widen as demand outpaces training. Component import dependency deepens as you assemble more but source nothing. You're not solving constraints, you're growing around them. Works until it doesn't. Works as long as Western companies see India as insurance against China dependency, not replacement. The moment that binary flips, contradictions surface. Expected to operate at full stack capability, that's when hidden gaps emerge. Can't rapidly scale semiconductor fabrication without solving land and skills simultaneously. Can't reduce component imports without building 30 years of supply chain in 5. Moral hazard is this. Visible success masks underlying fragility. India becomes dependent on continuous contract manufacturing work. What shifts when demand patterns change? The US and its allies want China plus one. Supplemental capacity, backup source, risk mitigation. Eventually, political logic pushes toward binary choice. What happens when Washington demands Apple pull production out of China completely, not just add to India? What happens when the Taiwan Strait tightens? At that moment, India becomes expected to deliver at full stack speed and scale. That's when constraints bite hard. You can assemble phones with imperfect labour skills, but can't fabricate semiconductors with 50-month land timelines. Can't scale rapidly when courts take 9 times longer than competitors. China succeeded because it faced no such pressure while building. Nobody demanded China become a full industrial economy in a decade. China built coastal zones first, then interior, then supply chains, then global integration, 40 years uninterrupted. India faces that same work in 10 years under scrutiny with geopolitical pressure, not acceleration. It's compression without relief. Different challenge entirely. Not impossible, just severely constrained. That constraint shapes the ceiling on how far India actually goes. Genuinely unsettling is the feedback mechanism. As manufacturing scales, land pressure increases. Demand for skilled labour accelerates. Supply chain complexity deepens. Each pressure, individually solvable, compounds the others exponentially. More factories need more land, which takes longer to acquire, delaying completion, delaying training, creating skill shortages, forcing wage increases, attracting migration, straining housing and logistics, slowing goods movement, weakening competitive advantage. Not doom. Other countries navigated this successfully. Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia, but each paid in time. Taiwan took 30 years building semiconductor capability. South Korea focused narrowly on autos and electronics before diversifying. Malaysia concentrated on specific zones before expanding. India tries to do all three simultaneously, at faster speed, under geopolitical pressure. Probability of success isn't zero. It's conditional on whether the Indian state solves land acquisition, whether skill training matches manufacturing growth, whether component suppliers invest before sustained demand appears. Your iPhone gets made in India because conditions exist today. 5 years forward, whether conditions persist depends on how India manages bottleneck feedback loops. We return where we began. The year is 2025. Semiconductor engineer in Taipei receives news. Her factory will move, not become obsolete, just move to India, where she oversees assembly while her company keeps design in Taipei. Capital stays concentrated, margins remain captured in Singapore and the US. You own an iPhone made in India. Apple owns the supply chain relationship. India won the next global manufacturing expansion. Not the whole game, just the visible piece. Assembly, volume, jobs, export numbers politicians cite proudly. Not architecture, blueprints, supply contracts, or the 30-year accumulated advantage of being near component makers. India will be the largest alternative to China. Not replacement, not rival, alternative. Not small. Alternatives to concentration represent genuine systemic risk mitigation worth billions, geopolitically significant. But understand clearly, India will make your devices. Others will own how they're made.